Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash the subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein specializes on Israel-Palestine conflict. His most famous book is Gaza, an inquest into his martyrdom, and his latest book is I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, Heretical Thoughts on Identity Politics, Cancel Culture, and Academic Freedom, with blurbs from Cornel West and Noam Chomsky. Professor Finkelstein, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with your recent interview with Piers Morgan. Towards the end, you said that you spoke about the humanitarian assistance that is being run with the help of United States and Israel. And you said that they are setting it up eventually to find an excuse to massacre people who would be availing it. And we are finding reports about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, is it? Them massacring reportedly 32 people, and now they are saying that that's not true. Can you talk about how could you so accurately predict that it would happen?
Let's start from the beginning. There was no need for a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. There was no problem with distributing aid into Gaza. There were hundreds of trucks outside Gaza waiting to come in. There was no lack of supplies. And whenever Israel wanted to distribute aid, easily was able to do so. So let's take two examples. At the end of March 2024, the International Court of Justice indicated some provisional measures because there was severe hunger looming in Gaza. Then on April 1st, you will remember, and your listeners will remember, when Israel killed members of the Central Food Kitchen in Gaza. When they killed those members of the Central Food Kitchen, there was a huge international uproar because it was Westerners. So their lives count. At that point, Israel knew it had to admit aid. Aid moved smoothly. Humanitarian aid, food, medicine, moved smoothly. Then when there was the prisoner exchange ordered by Trump, it was ordered on January 15th, 2025. It began January 19th. You will recall that part of that first, it was supposed to be in 3 phases, and the first phase was to admit humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid went smoothly because the United States said you're going to have to admit humanitarian aid. There was no problem with distribution. Israel had two objectives. Number one, for decades, it's wanted to get rid of UNRWA, the United Nations Work and Relief Agency, because UNRWA was the institutional embodiment of the Palestinians as a refugee question. And they wanted to turn a refugee question into a humanitarian issue. So it's just starving people, you have to feed them, as against refugees who have a right to return to their home. So they've been fabricating stories about UNRWA for decades now, trying to get rid of it. And the Israelis are like any adept, skillful elite. Every crisis, as you know, because you study Chinese, it used to be a cliche here. I'm not sure if it's true, I'm just saying it's a cliche, that the same Chinese character for crisis is the same character for opportunity. That's what used to be said. And so they saw the crisis of October 7th as an opportunity. The first opportunity was, for once and for all, to solve the Gaza question. But then, as you know, the opportunities began to grow. Solve the Hezbollah question, solve the Iran question, solve the West Bank question. They saw lots of opportunities. And one of the opportunities they saw was to solve the UNRWA question, to get rid of UNRWA. So they fabricated all these stories about UNRWA members being involved in October 7th. I suppose there were a few. You know, guess what? Hamas militants also need day jobs. So I'm sure 1, 2, 3, they said, you know, I think the number was 3 to 5, I can't remember, out of 30,000. 3 to 5 were allegedly, it's very murky what happened. The head of UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, he put, I think he fired 5 people, but their exact reasons why is unknown. Anyhow, it's totally beside the point. In any event, so now was their objective. They homed in on getting rid of UNRWA. And so they want to replace it now with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. It was obvious what they were doing. They had no distribution centers in the north. That means if you're in the north, if you stay, you starve to death. Period, full stop. They had 1 in the center of Gaza, and then 3 in the south. So everybody's going to move to the south, okay? Now, you know what's going to happen. Already Gaza was among the most densely populated places on earth on the eve of October 7th. Now you're going to have 2.1 million or 2.3 million people already in the among the most densely populated places on earth in 20% of Gaza.
United Nations has recently estimated 630,000 people being displaced since March of 2, when the ceasefire was disbanded.
So you're going to have teams of desperately hungry human beings converging on 3 food distribution centers. So you know what's going to happen. There's going to be rioting. It's a calculated and orchestrated rioting. Exactly what happened last year in what was called the Flower Massacre, where the hungry Palestinians ran to the truck. Israel soldiers said, we felt threatened, and they massacred the starving population of Gaza. So it was purpose, but actually the most, I feel like the most forthright description was in, of all places, the Financial Times. And the Financial Times made very clear what was happening. It said they're setting up a cluster of distribution centers in the south, and they said, quote, very close to the Egyptian border. And then they quoted Smotrich from the Israeli cabinet as saying the purpose of this current military offensive in Gaza is to get rid of all the... push them all out. So it was totally predictable what was going to happen. 3 distribution centers, 2.3 million people converging on them. Then a few warning shots by the Israelis create the riots, then the massacres, then another massacre, then another massacre, more tumult, more confusion, and then push them all into the Sinai. So How did I know? I know my people. I know exactly what they had in mind. It was perfectly obvious. I did notice, though, if I can comment, when I made that very predictable prediction on Piers Morgan's program, when I appeared with the ex-historian Benny Morris, I noticed that Piers Morgan was listening very intently to me. And you could see him processing the information. And I said, that sounds right. Yeah, it's obvious when you know the history. Even just knowing the recent history happened with the Piers Morgan program. I went back to 1948 because during the war, 1948 war, it begins roughly November 1947 with the passage of the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, 1947. It begins as a civil war. The Arab countries aren't yet involved. And actually, the civil war, if you read Benny Morris carefully, it probably would have quieted it down very quickly. But another crisis, another opportunity. So the Israelis escalated their retaliatory strikes to get an upward spiral of chaos and destruction so they can use this opportunity to solve the Palestine question within the borders of the state of Israel. And then by 1948, October 1948, Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, famously says, there's only one function now for the Arabs in the land of Israel, that is to flee. There's only one function now, that is to flee. And come October 48, the massacres in what became the state of Israel start to escalate and escalate because they wanted now to finish off the question of the Arabs in Israel. And I said we're now at that point in Gaza, the escalation of the massacres to once and for all solve this question. And if you ask my opinion, I can't prove this. Some things I can demonstrate, some things I can't. When you read the Financial Times article, which I posted on my Twitter account, it was clear that the British know exactly what's going on. And that's why they started to denounce Israel, because they wanted to keep their hands clean at the moment when they knew this is it. Israel was going to push them out. So they decided we have to be on record as opposing the second great, I don't like to use the terminology, I find it a little bit, what's the word? It's not stereotypical, but the second Nakba, they knew what Israel was doing, and they wanted to distance themselves. So you remember the French, Canadians, and British denounced what Israel was doing. Then the Germans weighed in. Then the Nazi princess, Ursula von der Leyen, weighed in. Then the foreign policy, the EU foreign policy chief, Kalia Kallas, I can't remember her name, she weighed in. They all needed to have it on record that we opposed it, because they all knew what Israel was planning.
Do you think now that there is a larger shift, we don't know what that shift in Europe would eventually lead to, but to the extent that there seems to be a shift, larger shift would that make any difference?
No, I don't really. We have to be sober about these things. I was talking with my webmaster yesterday. She manages all my social media. Brilliant woman, a Palestinian, a chemist in Greece. Really impressive. And I like the Chinese proverb, or if I've coined a Chinese proverb, it's better never than late. Better never than late. There's nothing left in Gaza. 90% of the housing has been destroyed. Half of the universities have been destroyed. The arable land has been destroyed. In the eastern part of Gaza, the arable land has been destroyed. There's nothing left. So even if Israel doesn't manage to carry out a large-scale expulsion, because now all the countries are condemning it, even if it doesn't manage, still, there's no way it's going to be rebuilt. You have to have enough experience with these matters. The moment anybody who believes Israel is going to allow Gaza to be rebuilt really needs some serious therapy. There's no possibility of that. The moment the cameras turn away again, it'll all be forgotten. And the people of Gaza will have to, by hook or by crook, figure out a way to leave. So I don't think they're just doing it because they knew what was coming.
Gaza Ministry of Health Director Dr. Monir Bursh recently said that there are 3,000 trucks lined up at the Egyptian border of medical supplies, which hasn't been allowed to enter, which has meant tremendous, terrible consequences.
And when they wanted to enter, there's no problem. Remember, they say Hamas is taking the aid, and we have to search the trucks. And you know how they make them unload the truck, load the truck, unload the truck, load the truck. Anybody who wants, my late mother used to say during the Vietnam War, there are people who said the U.S. wasn't committing atrocities in Vietnam. And she once said, anyone who wants to know knows. And if you don't want to know, you'll never know. And everyone knows what Israel is doing. It had an announced policy of starvation. And that announced policy began not in March. That announced policy began October 9th, 2023, when Defense Minister Galland said no food, fuel, water, or electricity will be admitted to Gaza. Now, what happened was there was a fluctuation. Sometimes the U.S. put pressure on them because it was looking so bad. And sometimes they were given a free hand. But the announced policy at the beginning of March of this year, 2025, was simply a reiteration of the same policy all along. But the same policy all along, it was implemented in an uneven way, depending on the amount of external pressure.
If you could give us your sense of the mood within U.S. top official about how to deal with what's going on in Gaza and with Israel, because there are these discussions about some divisions within the Trump administration. On one hand, we are seeing Steve Witkoff negotiating directly with Hamas. On the other hand, he is completely reiterating what is coming from Netanyahu's administration. And a lot of people about 2 weeks ago, or right after the US withdrew from Yemen, without involving Israel. And there were some other developments, firing of Mike Waltz and so on. They were thinking that there might be some shift within the Trump administration. But as things have moved on, my own sense is that there is no shift within the U.S. administration. Can you share your thoughts on that?
I don't have deep thoughts about it. I've not followed it closely enough. But I think the general contours are pretty obvious. President Trump wants to deal with Saudi Arabia, what he calls the deal of the century. The Saudis have to show something for the Palestinians in order to sell them out. They have to show something. So you might remember when the Abraham Accords were signed with the UAE claimed that had they not signed the accords, Israel was going to annex the West Bank. Mm-hmm. That was their pretext. Now, of course, Israel wasn't going to annex the West Bank. The UAE just made that up, so it can't be accused of selling out the Palestinians. And the same thing with the Saudis. Everybody knows that the people of Gaza are being starved, verging on experiencing a famine. These are technical terms, the difference between starvation, there's this whole gradation of terms, hunger, food insecurity, then starvation, and then famine. So for the layperson, these are all synonyms, but they've come to represent gradations of suffering. In any event, everybody knows there's starvation in Gaza, and it's unseemly for the Saudis to sign a deal unless they can show something for Gaza. Mm-hmm. So that's one consideration for President Trump. He wants to put that deal through, but if, say, all the Palestinians are expelled all the Palestinians in Gaza are expelled in one fell swoop, it's going to make it very tough for the Saudis to sign up. And the other consideration is Trump is fully aware that Gaza turned into an albatross for the Biden administration. And he doesn't want, and it didn't sink his presidency, but it was a factor. Mm-hmm. And we can say reasonably, it wasn't a trivial factor in Biden's unpopularity and then Kamala Harris's unpopularity come November 2024. So once the cameras are focused on Gaza, as they are now at this particular moment, you could see that the coverage has become really, Israel's not having an easy time. You just saw it in Piers Morgan's interrogation of Hatovelli. It was pretty brutal. It was a funny interrogation because nobody asks the obvious questions. So he kept pressing her. How do you know 30,000 Hamas terrorists were killed, but you don't know how many children were killed? How do you know there are 30,000 Hamas terrorists, but no, you don't know the children? And he wouldn't let go. He knew he had a good line there. Mm-hmm. And he was going to run with it. He was going to run right through her with it. He was going to, a lance. He was going to kill. But nobody asked the obvious question.
How do you know the 30,000?
How do you know the 30,000 are Hamas terrorists? The number's just pulled from thin air. You know where they get the number from? I said it months ago. I said over a year ago. Every time the Gaza Ministry of Health puts forth a number for the number of Palestinians killed, they take half.
1:1.
Yes, and they'll say, get a 1-to-1 ratio. So now the Gaza Ministry of Health is saying 55 or so thousand Gazans have been killed. So they say 30,000 are Hamas terrorists. So they can say we have the best ratio of civilians to combatants killed in the world, which Mr. Netanyahu keeps repeating even now. The best ratio. That's where they get the number. How could they possibly know the number? There are no battles in Gaza. Hamas militants are being killed pro rata with its percentage of the population. When Israel indiscriminately bombs here, indiscriminately bombs there, indiscriminately bombs there, it's going to kill some Hamas militants. That's otherwise, how many people are being killed? There are no battles. When is the last time, seriously, when is the last time you heard an Israeli was killed in Gaza? There is no mention anymore. Once in 2 weeks, once in a month. So if the deaths are occurring in indiscriminate bombings and artillery shelling, how would they know how many are Hamas militants? It's not like Hamas militants carry around an ID terrorist. So how would they know? The reason the Gaza Ministry of Health doesn't give a figure for the number of combatants killed is because they don't know. A young man comes in, he doesn't have a terrorist ID card, so they don't know. The numbers are just made up. So Piers Morgan, it was a good question, obviously. It killed her. It was not her favorite moment. But its premise is all wrong. All the numbers are made up by the Israelis, except their own number killed, because Israel is a small place. So they post on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website the names of everybody killed. If somebody notices, hey, my son is not there or my daughter is not there, then it becomes a news story. But other than their number killed, all the numbers are just fabricated.
You mentioned about the Abraham Accord and how Qatar was saying that if this...
I don't think Qatar, United Arab Emirates.
UAE, okay. How they were saying that if this doesn't happen, there would be a total annexation of the West Bank. I wanted to ask you, is the Abraham Accord effectively dead now? And is the Trump administration taking what your colleague Moin Rabbani said, a bifurcated approach, kind of delinking U.S. policy towards the Arab world from the U.S. policy in Palestine? Because recently there were the delegation from UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia who wanted to go to the West Bank and raise the question of Palestinian statehood, but they were banned by the Israelis. And the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, Faisal bin Farhan Al Saud, he called the Israelis an extremist, taking an extremist actions. And this is coupled with the new move to legalize tens of settlements whose status were earlier in the West Bank left kind of undecided, even though de facto on the ground these were settlements, despite over and above sanctioning new settlements. What's your sense of the relationship that the U.S. would have to the Gulf states and Israel? Would they be dealing completely from now on?
I'm speaking with no great insight, so I have to caveat what I say. Trump is a deal maker. That's in his DNA. He sees a big real estate deal possible with the Saudis. You wrote to me not long ago, you said because they need the Gulf investments, the Gulf money. That's probably part of it. And part of it is he sees a real estate bonanza possible in the Arab world. So I don't think, my impression is, if he's the last word, which he is, he's not thinking in what you would call geopolitical terms. He recognizes Israel as an important military asset. You'd have to be blinder than King Lear not to see it. So, of course, he wants to preserve that military asset, but he also wants what he calls the deal of the century with the Saudis. And everything would move along swimmingly, as it was moving along swimmingly before October 7th, 2023. In my opinion, based on no information whatsoever, that was the prime impetus of Hamas on October 7th, 2023. They realized this whole conflict with the Arab world was being resolved above their heads. that they would just be left there to languish and die. But the Saudis have to show something. Now, the obvious precedent for what I'm talking about, what I'm describing, was 1977. Jimmy Carter is the president of the United States. Carter's an extremely smart guy, very focused, preternatural powers of mental concentration. And he comes into office, he wants to resolve the whole conflict with the Arab world, because it's shortly after the 1973 war. He's elected in 1976. And it's shortly after the 1973 war with the Arab oil boycott and everything. And Carter comes in with an agenda. The agenda is mostly focused domestically, but there were foreign policy aspects to it. One of them was resolving the issue of the Panama Canal. And another one, the big agenda item, was the Arab world. Now, he talked about then, at that point, it was considered complete sacrilege, not of a Palestinian state, but he used the expression a Palestinian homeland. And even that language, the Israelis, their supporters, liberal to far right, wouldn't accept language, a Palestinian homeland. We're still in the era, the 1973 war was fought when Golda Meir was the prime minister of Israel, and she was the one who famously said there's no such thing as Palestinians. So we're still in that mentality. He wants to resolve the whole conflict with the Arab world. It was clear Israel was not going to go along, and Carter was not going to put enough pressure on Israel to force it to go along. So he dropped the whole idea. There had been a declaration issued by the US and Russia, the Soviet Union, about resolving the whole conflict. The US backtracked, and it decided the most it could do was to resolve the Israel-Egypt dimension of the conflict, because there Israel had a real material interest. Israel, as Moshe Dayan, at that point he was the foreign minister of Israel, he famously said, if you remove one wheel from a car, it can't move. And Egypt had, it's hard to believe now, but Egypt was the foremost power in the Arab world back then. And it was the main military power. And the view was, if we could remove
and
Egypt,
ideological, building on the Nasser.
It was competing with the Saudis.
Mm-hmm. At that time.
Yeah. It was the
leader during Nasser's time by late 70s.
But throughout, there was a famous book called The Arab Cold War. I can't remember the fellow's name. He was I think the president of the Arab University in Beirut, the AUB. His name, maybe it'll come back to me. It was called the Arab Cold War. It was the Cold War between the Saudis and the Egyptians, really, the Egyptians and Syrians versus the Saudis and the reactionary Gulf states. In any event, so there was a possibility for a deal with Israel. However, at that point, the Palestinian question had a huge amount of symbolic power. It wasn't material power. It was symbolic power. Mm-hmm. And Sadat, the president of Egypt, Sadat, he needed Saudi backing for this deal with Israel. Otherwise, he was going to be totally isolated in the Arab world. He needed that Saudi backing. So Carter goes to the Saudis and says, we need you to support this Israel-Egypt peace. The Saudis say, we can't do it unless you give something to the Palestinians. And that something had to be a Palestinian state. Carter says, I can't give that to you because Israel will never accept. The Saudis then say, we can't support the deal because of that symbolic power. The Palestine question resonated in the Arab world. And what happens? Two things happen. After they signed the deal, number one, Egypt is expelled from the Arab League. The Arab League meets, Egypt is kicked out. And number two, Sadat gets assassinated. Right. He had walked too far out on the limb, and he couldn't get any, he needed that Saudi support, because the Saudis would bring everybody else with them, except the Syrians. They'd be able to bring everybody else with them. So now on a much smaller scale, the Saudis need something. Right now, you know, there's all this talk that the French and the Saudis are going to announce in June support for a Palestinian state. Like, oh yeah, that's really relevant now, Palestinian state. You know, totally beside the point. So the Saudis need something. And I think those are the two considerations for Trump. A, the Saudi deal and what needs to be done to get that deal. And B, not having that Gaza albatross weighing him down as it did Biden.
You mentioned about the Piers Morgan debate. I had two quick questions on that. One, do you think there is a shift in Piers Morgan himself? I mean, he has been, of course, inviting people on both sides, but we all know he was more hostile to one side than another, and some people are now observing a shift. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that. And if you could also comment on why did you choose to address Benny Morris as Benny this time, while earlier you used to call him Professor Morris? Was there something conscious in that choice?
Well, first of all, I have to be fair about facts. Sometimes people don't like it when I'm too fair. Like I always say, I think Chuck Schumer was a very smart guy. I know that. I knew him by reputation in high school. He was ahead of me, but I knew him by reputation. I knew his sister, and the apples didn't fall far from the tree. She was just really a memorable person. There's no question about it. I remember I was once in a car with some friends from high school, and we got to talking about Chuck Schumer's sister, Fran. And one person said, everybody liked Fran. And I said, really? That's usually, there's the kind of competitiveness and ambition, and it brings out, and she was top of the line. And somebody said, well, the thing about Fran is she didn't compete against the other girls in the class. She was just competing against herself. She was so far ahead of everybody. There was no thought given to competing with the people behind her. So, as I say, I tried to be fair to Chuck Schumer, though I thought the book he wrote was, it was so remarkably bad.
We have a detailed discussion of his book with Professor Finkelstein on our channel, just to plug that in.
Once I was debating Alan Dershowitz, and I was referring to the book, which has him listed as the author on the front cover. And I kept saying...
Did he write the book?
I kept saying, the book you claim to have written, the book you claim to have written. And finally, he had to react. And he said, what do you mean, claim to have written? So I realized now I was in libel suit territory. So I have to be very careful about my words.
He threatened to sue you for that.
Yeah, no, for other things.
Okay.
So I have to be very careful about that. So I said, Professor Dershowitz, for your sake, I hope you didn't write that book. And that's how I feel with Chuck Schumer. For his sake, I hope he didn't write that awful book. Anyway, so I acknowledge his intelligence. I don't know how much of it is actually endured, because he doesn't really come across now.
You're talking about Benny Morris.
No. Chuck Schumer acknowledging.
Okay.
So in the same way, you were asking me about Piers Morgan, and I said I have to be fair about these things. He is the only one in a relatively mainstream program who had me on the past 19 months.
Correct.
The only one. Have I been on any mainstream television? No. Have I been on programs like MSNBC? Have I been in any liberal programs?
Al Jazeera invited you.
Yeah, but I wouldn't put that. I'm talking about the Western world.
Okay.
Have I been on things like Steve Colbert or any of these? No.
Or Ziteo?
Ziteo, no. No, I've not been on any. And he had me on, I think, I could be wrong, but I think it was the 8th time he had me on his program. So I have to acknowledge that. He's always been respectful to me. He doesn't treat me like a wild man in the wings. But as to the shift, as I said, everybody has shifted now. There's been I think that, as I said, there's a fear of what's coming next. That Israel is going to try for that big second Nakba. Mm-hmm. And so now everybody is becoming much more, even Ursula von der Leyen, the Nazi princess, the head of the European Commission, even she's criticizing Israel. So I would say he falls within that cluster of individuals in prominent positions who have changed their opinion. Now, if you ask Piers Morgan, he says, because the facts have changed. Well, I don't believe the facts have changed at all. The very same order that was issued at the beginning of March 2025, no food, fuel, water, electricity will be admitted into Gaza, was the very same order that was issued on October 9th, 2023. The facts haven't changed. With all due regard to Piers Morgan, for 19 months, he had been saying that Israel was using disproportionate force. That's not, in my opinion, that's not correct. Israel was using proportionate force. Proportionate to a genocide. There is a cliche, not so much a cliche, a simplified version of Kuhn's theory of the scientific revolution, which says, basically, it says that you have a paradigm. And then all of these anomalies start to occur, which can't be accommodated by the paradigm. And at some point, the anomalies become so overwhelming that the paradigm is shattered. You need a new paradigm. So, with that being said, if you start with the paradigm that a war was unfolding in Gaza, all of these anomalies start to appear. The number of medics killed, unprecedented. The number of journalists killed, unprecedented. The number of UN workers killed, unprecedented. The eyewitness foreign doctors who say children are being targeted in the skull and in the chest. 90% of the civilian housing destroyed. Systematic attacks on hospitals. At some point, all of these unprecedented anomalies must force you to confront the question, is the paradigm of war correct? Is that the correct paradigm for understanding what's happening in Gaza? And once you recognize, as I think is overwhelmingly clear now, the right paradigm, it's a genocide. And within that paradigm, the forces used is absolutely proportionate. Proportionate to the objective. The objective in Gaza is not to disable or defeat your military opponent. That's a war. The objective is to defeat or disable your military opponent. That's a war. But it's not a war in Gaza. There isn't a military opponent. There are no Israeli soldiers being killed anymore. There weren't even at the beginning. It was less than one per day during the first half year. It was less than one per day. Now I doubt it's even 1 in 2 weeks. So by claiming the force used, as Piers Morgan kept saying for 19 months, the force used was disproportionate, that was assuming that Israel was fighting a war, which he was emphatic about. He kept saying Israel had the right to defend itself. Israel wasn't defending itself. Israel was committing a genocide, which is something very different. So I would say that I have to give credit where credit's due. He was willing to have me on. But I cannot say that I can calculate. I don't know the kinds of pressures he was being exerted on him. Was pressure being exerted on him not to have me on, and he kept having me on, or he wasn't being pressured and it was good for ratings? I don't know. I can't say. But I will say, because it's fair, like with Chuck Schumer, I'll say he's smart. I'm not going to deny that. I'll say he had me on. And nobody else would. I mean, it's just a fact. I wrote the only political history of Gaza, scholarly history of Gaza. There are a few other things, but there's no research, serious research. So you would think on those grounds alone, I would be the first person to be consulted. Sarah Roy wrote the only economic history, serious, comprehensive economic history. So when issues came up, for example, let's take an obvious issue. It was said over and over again that the reason that Gaza was a basket case before, economic basket case before October 7th, the reason was always given because Hamas misused the money, right? Misused the aid. They should have asked her. She would have been the first person. Hey, she's got the credentials. She attended Harvard as an undergraduate. She got her graduate degree from Harvard. She works at the Middle East Center in Harvard. So she's got the bona fides. I didn't see her consulted anywhere. I think I've just checked her book, which is what I did. If you look at the book, she has a new, it's not new anymore, but she has a new preface, a very lengthy preface, about 2018, something like that. And you look at all the economic reports. There was one report out of hundreds, maybe even thousands, which said that Hamas corruption was, or Hamas mismanagement was a problem. Not the main problem, but a problem. Everybody else said the same thing. It was the blockade. Gaza was economically a basket case because of the blockade. But they didn't ask her. And nobody, my book never mentioned. It's the only book never mentioned. You'll see reading lists. You'll see London Review of Books will have a large number of books reviewed. New York Review of Books on Gaza, new books. Never mentioned. So in the face of all of that, the fact that Piers Morgan had me on, and B, he treated me respectfully. He did. So I have to acknowledge that. That's a fact. As to my treatment of Benny Morris, it's funny you should ask the question why I was calling him Benny, because in that first famous or infamous debate between Wayne Romani and myself on one side, and Benny Morris and that thing called Destiny on the other side, it was the Lex Fridman show. When the program ended, it was a marathon. It was 5 hours, I think. Yeah, I think it was 5 hours. Was it 3 hours?
4 and something.
4 and something hours. So Wayne and I were, incidentally, at the end of the debate, Benny Morris came over to Wayne and I to shake our hands. I had resolved I wasn't going to shake his hand. If that moment came, I wasn't going to. But he just came across as so avuncular, like your uncle, and he was physically unprepossessing. So, forget it. I'll just shake his hand. And we three walked out together. Now you might ask, and what happened to that thing called Destiny? Well, after we walked out, he came down. And I'll never forget, he was walking, I only saw him from the back, but he had a very unsteady gait, like it sunk in. This was a disaster. That thing called Destiny and his Ouija board, which was driving me crazy. Like he was trying to levitate the table. He was with his laptop. In any event, when we were walking out, Moines turned to me and he said, "Norman, that was really funny what you did with changing his name." I said, "Wayne, what are you talking about?" He said, "You kept calling him by a different name." I said, "No, Wayne, what are you talking about?" I had no idea I had done that. That guy just got under my skin. You know, the younger generations, they coined the expression to trigger. That guy triggered me. I mean, he's such a complete buffoon. So I wasn't aware. And in the same way with Benny Morris, I wasn't aware I called him Benny, as against Professor Morris. But I found him really intolerable. I did. You know, it's a perplexity to me. Honestly, it's a perplexity. I've talked about it with Moeen. I've talked about it with Jamie Stern Weiner. Why would somebody destroy their career that way?
Or intellectual legacy. Maybe career is not destroyed.
If you were to flip around the camera for just one moment. So sitting here are his books, right? You'll see I have 3 versions, 3 separate copies of one book, 2 separate copies of another book. I read all of them multiple times. And what is one supposed to conclude? I even have, believe it or not, I have these very elaborate indices I created. This is all typed up, indexing his books. Look at, no, it's all typed up, meaning I sit down, copy long passages, and it goes on and on and on. Remember, scholarship is ultimately an act of faith. You can't go back and check every archival source. He scoured archives. And ultimately, you're relying on good faith that he accurately rendered what he found. But then when he relentlessly lies, the only rational conclusion is, maybe everything he wrote in the past is also a lie. Why should you assume he was telling the truth back then? You couldn't check the sources.
And that's a scary thing for a scholar.
It's scary, but he's sabotaging his whole reputation. He's sabotaging it. I've always written from day one that there was a political agenda in Morris's work, but still there was real research and real value. But now he calls into question his whole scholarly record. Israel only attacks Hamas. That's how he began. There may be a few, rotten apples, but these are just aberrations. That there's no, as he said during the Lex Friedman debate, there's no starvation in Gaza. And he said it again. And this time Piers Morgan said, if you don't allow in any food for 2 months, what do you think is going to happen?
He said enough food is going.
Yeah. And when Piers Morgan ripped into him, he sat quiet. He sat quiet. He said that Israel wants to build a distribution center in the north. Really? As it launched a new military operation just a few days ago to clear out the north. So it's going to build a distribution center there. That there was no poll. I was mentally imbalanced when I said there was a poll that said half of Israelis support genocide. He said,
the Penn State University poll.
It was actually not Penn State. It's a misunderstanding. Penn State commissioned the poll. It was done by a reputable Israeli polling firm. It was an Israeli, a very reputable, I'm told, polling firm. And it was reported everywhere. In fact, it was first reported in Haaretz, the Hebrew edition, to which Morris himself has often contributed. But he said it was a total lie, and it was an instance of my mental instability. Every word out of his mouth was a lie. It's not like I hold professors in such high regard that suddenly I realize he's just a fraud. So I called him Benny. Probably unconsciously, I had just lost respect for him. It was at one point I said, you've reduced yourself to a Holocaust denier. And then I said, Benny, just try for 1 minute not to lie. Just try for 1 minute not to lie. I find it is a perplexity to me. There was solid work by him, and now he casts a dark shadow over everything. And exactly what's his motivation? I hear people say different things. I'm not sure.
Just to shift the conversation a little bit, and I'm coming to the close, talking about triggering you, the thing, as you said, I also triggered you today behind the camera, and we had a debate regarding Chat GPT, and as I see it, really a question about teaching and how to build human capital. And
I would never, I know you are in part an economist by training, but I am revolted. The whole of my innards enters into revolt against expressions like human capital.
so if you could
Human
share,
beings.
excuse me, if you could share with our viewers why you lashed out against me, that I think could interest a lot of viewers.
You treat, when I'm able to, and that's a crucial caveat, when I'm able to, I teach. I've never taught on a steady basis. I never was tenured. I taught semester to semester. You get hired, you get fired, you have no say in the matter. You find out a week or two before they need you or they don't need you. But on the other hand, because I was not tenured, except for that terrible period from 2007 when I was denied tenure and I was effectively blacklisted, until about 2019. It was a very bleak period in my life. I taught off and on, but because I was an adjunct, I got the worst courses to teach, which were the ones with lots of students, which means lots of grading. And so I probably had more experience teaching than tenured professors. A tenured professor gets 2 courses one semester, 1 course, let's say at NYU, 2 courses one semester, 1 course the next semester, and then they get sabbatical every 3 years to do research. Their courses are, seriously, well, you'll know because you're at University of Chicago. You ask them, how many students in your class? 6, 8, 10? When I teach, it's a 30, 35, sometimes 2, sometimes 3 courses a semester. So I have a lot of teaching experience. Now, AI became a real challenge for me this semester. It became a challenge because in the past, first of all, it was fairly easy to detect plagiarism. It wasn't so frequent. It was a problem, but you would not call it epidemic. And secondly, there were ways to get around the problem. So if you have a very focused question for a paper, it would be hard to find a source that can fill in, so to speak, the blank of a 3 or 5 page paper. Now, however focused is the question, and you'll concur, I gave you examples of very focused questions. How would you answer, what would be the best response to the Solomon Islands submission to the International Court of Justice in the 1996 nuclear weapons case? And as I showed you on the screen, a full paper comes up if you enter that question in Chat GPT. A full paper written, the whole paper is written out. So it became a real challenge. And in order to rise to that challenge, there were 2 major obstacles. First of all, it's very time intensive. You have to sit down with a student and go through the paper line by line and say, what does that mean? Read the next sentence. What does that sentence mean? Read the next sentence. What does that reference mean? Read the next sentence. Because the students dig in their heels. They're very confident that they can jump through the hoops with AI. that they cannot be traced. So there's the labor intensity, and then there's another thing. It creates an enormous amount of animus between you and the student. I never in 40 years of teaching had such an acrimonious relationship with several students, not one, several, over this issue. I would persist, and they would persist. They dug in their heels. If I had not been the age I am, which is 71, if I were at the beginning of my career, I couldn't do it. Because when you're an adjunct, you are dependent on what are called the student evaluations. And if enough students start giving you zeros, which is their retaliation for the interrogation and ultimately humiliation that they had to suffer at my hands, I would suffer markedly, palpably in the student evaluations. Even now, I didn't like it. I knew I'm going to get a lot of zeros. On a scale of 1 to 10, how was the professor's class structured? 0. How was the professor's, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And I don't like that. It makes me feel bad. In any case, our differences come down to that expression you used, human capital. For you, this is all a kind of mechanical issue. Am I going to invest my time and energy in tracking down this misrepresentation of your work? Am I going to invest it? Or, I have more important things to do. The student cheated, who the hell cares? Let's move on. And
just to add, so that you don't misrepresent me, I think it's not just because I think I have a lot of other things to do. I do think that real education, moving away from the framework of building human capital, real education in a more Chomskyan way or William van Humboldt's way, comes from this inner incentive, inspiration to look at things and read, as opposed to someone policing you and forcing you to do something.
Look. That's the ideal.
And you called me a bourgeois for having that.
That's an ideal. Of course it's the ideal. I have a wonderful student. I have many wonderful students. They compete with anyone at University of Chicago, and I think they will prevail. So I had one student, Lucan Sindara, still, I'll give his name, brilliant student. And I was talking to him about the dilemmas of AI. And his response struck me. He said to me, why would you want to use AI? It takes all the fun out of writing a paper. I like to display my knowledge. That's, the ego. I want to show how much I know. And I really admired that response. He was like an artist. That's an art. Would an artist use AI? Of course not. An artist wants to create. They have that inner drive to create. They're not going to appropriate a song from AI. And they love the idea that they are putting on display for admiration their creative capacities. So that's the ideal. But for most people, a chasm separates the ideal from this is just grunt work that I need to do to get my degree and get my diploma. Get my diploma and get my degree. And I feel there's something about maintaining a standard. I tell the students, I say, don't do AI with me. It's not going to work. I have a reputation for tracking down work by people who didn't do the work they alleged to have done. But I say, I still have vivid recollections from college. I made errors. I did things I shouldn't have done to get grades I didn't deserve. So I say, I'm not going to pretend to holier than thou. You just rewrite the paper and no penalty. Just rewrite the paper. So I do everything I can to be fair, but I tell the students, I don't teach for money. I teach it because I believe in teaching. And I'm not going to pretend as if the work you submitted is yours. It's not. And I think Professor Chomsky, who took the teaching profession so seriously that it would terrify you. Chomskyan linguistics is not just an intellectual achievement or conquest, knowing nothing about the field. Nothing, zero. I would never dare ask him. I know the response would not have been positive, so I stayed away from it. It was not just an intellectual attainment, achievement, conquest. He created a field. Do you know what that means? Hundreds of graduate students around the world formed departments because they were his students. Do you know how many dissertations that means? He had to have read. In every country in the world, there's 1, 2, or 3, even at Brooklyn College, at City University, 2 of my friends now, John Nissenbaum, Sam X, I can pronounce his last name. Sam, he's Palestinian, John is Jewish, and they team together. They're both Chomsky's students. I mean, literally, they were his students. He read their dissertations. Everywhere you go, Chomsky student, Chomsky student, Chomsky student. But not like a student of like, he's read a few books and is inspired. No, literally his student. On top of his 10,000 other achievements, Professor Chomsky created a field in the double sense, the intellectual breakthrough, but also the physical creating of departments by his students. So I don't think he would have accepted an AI paper. He would not.
Yeah, I don't think our differences were about whether we should accept an AI paper. It was about whether those students of Professor Chomsky became those students because A, they were at the MIT, and B, they were probably more inspired by Professor Chomsky.
Totally correct. You didn't have to face that problem. Mm-hmm. But now when you teach, there are large numbers of students who just want that degree. I don't fault them. And actually, in my opinion, that kind of utilitarian attitude can be overcome if you are stimulating enough in your teaching, if you care enough about reaching young minds, then however utilitarian their approach might be upon entering the classroom, you could get their minds to work. Their minds, I don't know how, in the era of iPhones and social media and institutionalized gossip, passing as intellectual labor. You told me about a particular commentator who reads 2,500 Twitter accounts a day. Twitter is just gossip. It's not an argument. It's not the composition of a thought worked out. It's a tweet is to thought as a belch is to a sonata. So, despite all of that noise, the minds are still nimble. There were many classes. I came home and said, damn, those students are really good. And I'll send them a group email on what's called Blackboard, saying, damn good class. Now, there were bad classes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I would blame myself. There were bad classes. But even with a utilitarian attitude, you can reach them. But sometimes, even if you reach them, the laziness sets in. I'll just go on AI. And I'll fight it.
I think the last point here, which might be of the viewer's interest on the utilitarian point, there's this categorical point that you described earlier, which is, I wouldn't use it because it's about displaying my knowledge, or it's
that's what Lukinson said.
Yeah, being more faithful about to myself more than anyone else.
I don't think it was faithful. He genuinely liked the joy of learning and discovering what he's capable of.
Yeah, so there's that very categorical sense of it. And then there's the utilitarian aspect, which...
Utilitarian, I don't blame. First of all, school's expensive. Mm-hmm. Second of all, I mean, in my day, school was free. City University was free. State University was free. Free. F-R-E-E. Secondly, no one, I'm telling you, no one except pre-meds, ever thought about work. Pre-med, you had to do the biochem, organic chem, inorganic chem. There was, in order to get medical school. So it began freshman year, okay? Anything else, we never thought about a job. Never. You know why?
There were jobs.
There were jobs. We always knew when we graduated, when we were ready to get a job, we would get a job. There was no thought to it. So, no tuition, no fear of a job. Parents never asked you what you were majoring in. My parents, the last day, if you ask, what is Norman majoring? I have no idea. They didn't care. Why should they care? This was like summer camp, but it was free. 4 years, no cost, and he'll find a job. No worry. No worries. He'll find a job. Young people now, astronomical tuition, no jobs. Unless they can find an exact fit between their major and the job they want later. You know, that's why the major is now completely insane. Mm-hmm. Completely insane. I've never seen majors. What are you majoring in? Graphic design. Graphic design is actually one of the more substantive majors. Absolutely crazy majors. Because college has turned into a vocational school. Mm-hmm. It's not college anymore. College meant what we called back then a liberal arts education.
Now it is about the job market.
Now it's just the job market. It's vocational school. So I don't blame them when they're utilitarian. Mm-hmm. I get where that's coming from. But even with that, I do believe you can reach students. You can still reach them if you care enough about your subject matter. You can reach them. At least a good 90%. There will be some hopeless, I know that. Mm-hmm. But a good 90%. And you can have a lively, intellectually curious class.
There was this moment where you called me surrendering, kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but surrendering mental faculties to the will of the machine. And I called you a Luddite. And the example I gave you that I would use AI to get my useless language grant application written, but I would never use AI to write my thesis or my paper. For you, both are no.
Look,
just your thoughts.
Your mind is, in my opinion, your mind is incrementally taken over. And you've got to exercise maximum discipline to prevent your mind from being appropriated. I know I'm going to tell you something which you're going to think this guy is completely nuts. If I'm writing an email, I write October, O-C-T-B-E-R, and I meant October, okay? And the spell check immediately kicks in to make it October, right? I won't use it.
We had that experience today when I said that this is AI, don't worry about spelling, it understands. And you said, I know, but I care for it.
Yes, I will never let the machine take over me spelling. I will not. Because I know, Trotsky once said, Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionist, he says, human beings are intrinsically lazy. And he said, that's a good thing. That's what forces them to innovate, technologically grow, and so forth, because they don't want to work.
They want to get rid of that.
Yeah, they don't want to do the grunt work. So he said it's a good thing. I don't really agree with that. I think that it becomes very seductive to have the machine replace this, and have the machine replace that, and have the machine replace this and that. And before you know it, the machine is replacing your mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to let that happen. To my grave, I will keep correcting my spelling on my own. I'm glad it's alerting me that I made an error, but I will correct it myself.
I want to end by having just one question about your latest book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to that. And Noam Chomsky writes, badly needed and done with Finkelstein's usual verb and precision. And Cornel West writes, this book is both brilliant and brave. You have recently written a preface, second edition to it. If you could tell us, while writing the preface, you must have rethought about the book and its relevance in the contemporary moment. What struck you particularly about, I read it and I thought one important point here you mentioned is that there is this identity politics thing, which is what you mentioned as full left. And then there is a real left. There is a mention of the two words. So if you could tell us why it is important for the left to dissociate itself from that identity politics type, that I'm sure would be of our viewers' interest. And I thought if you could read out a few lines of this paragraph, because I really liked what you wrote there about identity politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the preceding paragraph, as a young man, until today, it's deeply inspiring to me that the left, the historic left, and I don't consider the left a fixed set of positions. I think there is what you might call a left tradition. And I continue to adhere to that left tradition, recognizing that a lot has changed. And a lot of the, so to speak, fixed positions of the left are no longer applicable to the current situation. The left consists of a tradition, historically some fixed positions, which, as I said, their relevance today is open to serious question. But it was a human type. A human type. The left, it stood on the shoulders of the European Enlightenment and the shoulders of European culture. I was reading last night over here the latest volume of Rosa Luxemburg's collected works translated into English. And there are many wonderful things about reading the great Rosa Luxemburg. But one of the things that's striking is the sheer facility with which she refers to history. She refers to economics. She refers to literature. Out of nowhere, there's a quote from Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. There's a quote from Goethe. There's a quote and a quote and a quote. They had absorbed the heights of European culture and the breadth of human knowledge.
This reminds me of Marx.
Right. But and then beyond that, because I was reading Marx today also, a biography of Marx, just skimming through pages, the willingness to sacrifice up to and including their lives for the cause, the acceptance of the fact that they will die in the struggle, and it never phases them. Rosa Luxemburg, who I quote, she says, she writes to a friend, I really hope to die at my post in a street fight or in prison. Now, Rosa Luxemburg was a very diminutive, physically very diminutive and frail. She had a hip impairment. And she died the most ghastly death. The precursors of the Nazis, what were called the Freikorps, during and after World War I, they caught her and beat her and beat her and beat her and beat her. A woman who observed it said, I had never in my life seen somebody beaten like that. And you think of Rosa with all the knowledge, all the delicacy, all the refinement, standing on the shoulders of all of European culture, being beaten and beaten by this beast of a man. And they all accepted that that was their fate as revolutionaries. I mentioned standing on the shoulders of European culture, and I quoted Lenin. Once he was listening to Beethoven's Appassionata, and Gorky, the Russian novelist, was in conversation with him. And Lenin wrote, quote, I could listen to Beethoven's Appassionata every day. I'm often unable to listen to music. It gets on my nerves. I would like to stroke my fellow human beings and whisper sweet nothings in their ears for being able to produce such beautiful things in spite of the abominable hell they are living in. However, today one shouldn't caress anybody, for people will only bite off your hand, strike without pity, although theoretically we are against any kind of violence. It is, in fact, an infernally difficult task. You know, that was the tradition. It inspired me then as a 18-year-old, and it inspires me now as I'm heading towards an 80-year-old, assuming I reach that point. And then there's this thing called cancel culture, wokeness. And so the passage you
Which
want...
also came in the name of activism. Like, it's ironical because you are talking about acting, right? When you are citing Lenin's or Rosa's willingness to go to the front and even die for, in the case of Rosa, it's your willingness to act. And ironically, identity politics also carried the flag of activism, but you wrote something that was striking there.
Identity politics is cut from a different cloth. It's not about the tedious work of educating and organizing. It's about likes, shares, and views. It's not about reading, researching, and reasoning. It's about tweets, memes, and hashtags. Its leaders are to be found not as once in Harlan County organizing a miners' strike, or in the trenches of Spain defending the Republic. Its leaders, identity politics leaders, they are to be found at a posh Big Ideas festival in Aspen, or an anti-racism soiree in the Hamptons. Its notion of sacrifice for the cause is charging a mere $15,000 for an online session of psychobabble, or a $50,000 speaker's honorarium for a public lecture of psychodrivel. And I go on to say, the stuff they turn out, you take the case of Ibram X. Kendi. He has spun 13 books, he calls them, out of his pablum, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It is only a matter of time before he releases the trilogy, How to Be an Anti-Racist Doorknob, How to Be an Anti-Racist Toilet Seat, and How to Be an Anti-Racist Light Bulb. This is just so, it's not unserious, it's just totally ridiculous. I was saying to you today, in the historic tradition of the left, there was what was called the class question or the social question. Then subsidiary to that, there was the national question, what we would call today national self-determination, the national question. There was the woman question. There was the Jewish question. There was the Negro question. The great questions of an epoch. Can anyone imagine Marx, Lenin, Rosa, Trotsky writing a treatise on the bathroom question? Whether we should have 1, 2, 3, you know, Che Guevara's famous remark, 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams. Now the big question is at the airports, should we have 1, 2, 3, many bathrooms? Not serious. It's not a tradition I want to be part of.
Well said. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for watching. I wanted to just rehash it at the end. Do buy the book. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it. It's full of entertainment apart from real analysis. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.